We're starting to fall behind other countries when it comes to clean energy goals. There's no going back at this point. These things are already happening. The US is missing out on business opportunities by canceling these clean energy projects.
At the time of this recording, the war in Iran has been waged for over a month. As a result, the price of oil around the world, and especially in the United States, has increased dramatically. But it's not just the fuel we're putting in our cars that is going up in price. It's the nitrogen that goes in our fertilizer that our farmers use to grow our crops. It's the diesel that transports those crops in trucks across the country, along with all of our other goods. It's the aluminum and copper that goes into our AI chips that we're building in our country and around the world to fuel our emerging technologies. The war in Iran and the closing of the Strait of Hormuz has created drastic price increases across the board in America. It represents our globalized economy and how interconnected our fuel supply is with the rest of the world. It also poses an opportunity for us to re-examine that energy economy. If we can create more energy in our country, we can be less reliant on unstable regions like Iran, like Russia, or like South America. My guest today is a master's student in energy engineering at Stanford University. Jasmine Blust has worked in the solar industry and is well versed in the energy economy and the transition to clean energy. We discuss these topics ranging from the war to the clean energy transition in today's episode. I learned a ton and I hope you will too. Jasmine is full of great knowledge and I really enjoy talking with her. This episode is super important to the conversation today about what our future looks like, both in energy, in climate, and in affordability. I hope you listen and leave a comment and let me know what you think. Thanks again for listening. This is Across the Aisle. I'm your host, Dylan Morse. This is episode 3. All right, episode 3 of Across the Aisle. I have another guest today. Jasmine Blust is here with me. Jasmine, if you would like to introduce yourself and just let the audience know who you are and how you ended up here and why we know each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Dylan. It's an honor to be here on your podcast today. So I'm Jasmine. I'm currently a graduate student at Stanford University. I'm in the Master's in Energy Science and Engineering program. And before this, grew up in Hawaii. I went to Johns Hopkins for my undergrad in environmental engineering. I graduated in 2021. And then I worked for 4 years in Washington, D.C. First 2 years as an energy consultant with Guidehouse, which I had a public sector client, the U.S. Department of Energy, and I worked on their appliance efficiency standards, specifically for lighting energy efficiency. And then the next 2 years after that, I worked for a solar developer called Summit Ridge Energy. They're based in Arlington, Virginia, and I was a project manager. So essentially I coordinated everything in the solar development pipeline from permitting all the way through construction and testing and acceptance of the project, and also interconnection with the grid, which is a very relevant topic in the electricity space right now. And through that time working in DC, I met the wonderful Allie White. She was my roommate for the 3 out of those 4 years, and through her, I met Dylan. So here I am today. And I decided to go back to school because I think it's a crucial moment right now to study energy topics. I think they're really making the news for a lot of reasons. And Stanford has always just been a a leader in this space and really inspirational to me. So I'm grateful to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, Allie was just on chatting up with us before we hit record. Yeah, she misses you guys, all the roommates. You guys had a really great group, and
Thanks,
I was super honored to be welcomed into the friend group when we got together.
Of course. Yes, you earned your right to join. You are worthy.
Thank you. Maybe to start, we can talk a little bit more about your background. Where did these interests in energy, electricity, all this stuff begin for you? Do you have a specific moment you remember from your childhood, or just a general interest?
Yeah, definitely. I think this has been a lifelong interest for me, starting at a very young age. Growing up in Hawaii, I think it's quite common to be interested in environmental and energy topics. Growing up in Hawaii, part of the culture is caring for the environment. Everyone spends a lot of time outdoors. We learn from a young age that our ecosystems are fragile. That's like a large focus in school. I remember my dad telling me from like 4 or 5 years old that like anthropogenic climate change is happening, and like it's not too late to do something about it. And so this has kind of been like my career focus my whole life, to just make as big of an impact I can on greenhouse gas mitigation. And so that interest has gone through a few different stages, I would say. Like in high school, I kind of just took like AP Environmental Science and getting familiarized with the different, first with like the underlying climate science that does prove that anthropogenic climate change is occurring. And then,
anthropogenic, you mean human caused?
Yes, that's right. Like as a direct result of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of fossil fuels. So that was a good introduction to the kind of different career paths you can take. I selected environmental engineering in college because I figured engineering is really like an impactful space. And that was a very like water focused program, which water is a super interesting and important issue that we could talk about another time itself. But with the like tides of the IRA around like 2022, the Inflation Reduction Act, there's just been such an interest and an acceleration in deployment of renewable energy. It seems like one of the biggest impacts I can make to greenhouse gas mitigation. And as you likely know, like the electricity sector is one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases.
Cool. Yeah, I want to touch on water a little bit when we talk about AI and data centers. But for now, I think Vermont and Hawaii maybe are similar in their appreciation for the outdoors and the environment. That's always been a big part of my life as well. And when I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be a marine biologist. And Shark Week was my favorite week of the year. I watched it all day long. And then I got to high school and took a biology class. And that was the end of my dream, to be a marine biologist. Because I was not gifted the math and science skills that you have, but I pivoted to the more politics and policy side of
There's
things.
always a way to make an impact. Yeah, I actually do find myself leaning more toward the policy space nowadays too. But I think like especially at Stanford, like there's such a emphasis on interdisciplinary applications. Like the technical folks and the policy folks like really depend on each other. Because you can't make good policy if it's not informed by data and research, and technical backing. So that's something I'm really trying to mend together in my career.
Great. That's super cool. Well, you mentioned the news, and I want to start with the war in Iran if we can. I'll kind of set the scene a little bit, and then I want to get your thoughts. We've been in the war for a little over a month now. The Strait of Hormuz has been compromised, leading to a great seismic increase in the cost of crude oil that goes through the strait on boats, leading to the gas we put in our cars. But not just that, the nitrogen in the fertilizer that our farmers use to grow their crops, or the aluminum and copper, rubber and plastic. Oil is in a lot of things, and those prices are rising right now. I was on my way home today, and I didn't get gas, but I'm trying to stretch it to tomorrow because the the sign at the gas station says 4.29, or for diesel 5.65, something crazy. I know in the United States right now the average is above $4 a gallon. So the war is really a huge energy interruption that could be quite cataclysmic. When this sort of interruption happens, where does your brain go in terms of the energy economy side of it?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for setting that up so eloquently. Yeah, we've all seen the headlines just coming out yesterday, I believe, that gas prices have reached $4 a gallon nationwide. And here in California, things are pretty painful at the pump. We were just on a road trip down to LA, and gas prices have exceeded $6 at most gas stations. So my mind immediately goes to, in these scenarios, just the volatility and fragility of fossil fuel supply chains. One, these resources are finite, which should be, in my opinion, should be enough reason for us to move past them and, focus on emerging technologies and renewable resources that are not dependent on depleting our natural resources. But also, yes, the economic standpoint of both like the energy security and the volatility of prices. Like energy security is a term that's thrown around a lot now. We have a big focus on it here at Stanford too. And what energy security essentially means is we don't want to depend on foreign nations for our critical energy supply for many obvious reasons. In case of conflict or geopolitical tension, things could get messy really quickly. So it's best to generate as much as we can on American soil.
It's unfortunate because it seems like the energy we rely on comes from the most unstable places in the world. Think of like the big spike in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine, now the Middle East, or a place like Venezuela. Sort of despotic regimes in unstable regions that we're relying on, our consumers are relying on. It's not a good recipe.
I know. It's such an unfortunate way that history has worked out in our world, where places rich in natural resources have been exploited for their resources, which has typically led to more unstable governance in that region. And we could, I'm sure we could talk about that that's a whole other rabbit hole to go down. Yeah, but exactly, it's no coincidence. But something I found interesting recently, I think there are actually some domestic policy levers that could be taken, and you might know more about this actually since you're in the government policy space, but this is something I heard from one of my classmates who I believe is in the public policy program at Stanford. I think a big reason that the energy crisis is being exacerbated right now is the Jones Act. So yeah, you're nodding your head. You've probably heard of this, but essentially it requires all goods transported between U.S. ports to be on U.S. built, U.S. flagged, and I think 75% U.S. crewed vessels. So there are a lot of oil tankers shipping oil from Houston that cannot go to the port in Boston, for example, and they can't transport that domestic production to our own country, which is ridiculous, just because a part of part of the ship was manufactured overseas, and of course it's cheaper to manufacture parts of ships overseas. We're in this conundrum, and it's super inefficient, and they're emitting even more greenhouse gases to route this ship all the way somewhere else because it cannot depart Houston and go somewhere in our country. So I know they have recently waived the Jones Act for 60 days, which maybe will help. But yeah, it seems interesting to me that there's some outdated policies that were put into place during a different time in America's history and with a different economic situation. And maybe some of those things could be looked at and improved to help with energy security and resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I knew more about the history of the Jones Act because it seems so unfitting now as a policy.
Exactly.
Because not only have we limited the energy that we create in this country for our own country, but we've also virtually stopped shipbuilding here.
That's true.
So we've really put ourselves in a bind where we can't access our own energy production. And in the last 2 decades, America has become a massive oil producer and exporter, one of the biggest in the world. But because it's so intertwined with the global economy, we're feeling the pain from these catastrophes overseas, these energy disruptions here, even though we have so much energy at our own. We produce so much, but we can't access our own energy.
Exactly. Yeah. It does seem completely counterintuitive, and I'm sure there was a good reason for the Jones Act at the time of its passing, but yeah, Washington, I guess, needs to figure some of those things out for modern day. I know it's hard to get anything passed, but
hopefully for more than 60 days, I think we might need it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's maybe a good segue to the topic of energy independence. That can take many different forms. Of course, we produce a lot of oil, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be oil. What are some other ways that we can garner some more energy independence in America?
Yeah, there are a multitude of ways. Of course, like renewable energy has always been, produced somewhere close enough to the demand center to just be able to be transported through transmission and distribution lines. I guess I'm talking specifically in the electricity sector right now. And I guess in general, I should specify that I am studying, I'm researching the electricity sector. So I'll talk about electricity for now. I think there's so many opportunities in this country for, reaching our renewable portfolio standards. Many states already have 100% renewable portfolio standards by a certain year. I believe in California it's 2045, and Hawaii it's also 2045. Other East Coast states like Rhode Island, Connecticut, I think are in the early 2030s or mid 2030s. And I know Washington, D.C. is actually the earliest to have a 100% renewable portfolio standard. I think it's 2032. I looked these up right before our podcast. And yeah, we're blessed with an abundance of natural resources here in America, not just fossil fuels like oil and gas, but also we have lots of opportunities for wind. We are generally we have a good solar resource. We've looked at maps in class of America's solar resource measured over every zip code in the country versus Germany and Germany in general. So we have a lot of Germans here at Stanford. And yeah, they are very, very ahead on renewable energy, and their grid is much cleaner than ours, but they have such a poor solar resource, yet they have put policies in place to make their grid much cleaner than ours.
Why is our solar resource better than theirs?
So by solar resource, I essentially just mean the irradiance from the sun. It's we get a lot more sun than they do. They're generally a very cloudy and overcast country weather-wise. Yeah, so yeah, by solar resource, I should specify that just means the actual sun coming in incident to the ground. So yeah, and I think for hydropower, we have already developed most of the viable sites, but we do have major sources of hydropower, especially in the Pacific Northwest. For nuclear, I think there's a lot of potential. Of course, nuclear has pros and cons. There have been events in history that make it controversial, but there are a lot of developments in the small modular reactors space now. So those are more modular and then enhanced geothermal is really interesting to me, because traditionally geothermal is very constrained by where you are in the world. So mostly just in volcanic regions with volcanic activity. But enhanced geothermal essentially essentially the technology is that you're going down to much deeper in the ground. And also battery storage paired with solar is super promising, and batteries are being deployed extremely rapid pace at the moment. So essentially, for those who aren't familiar, battery energy storage systems can essentially smooth the curve from variable renewable energy power. So we have solar and wind. Solar, as we know, is only going to produce electricity during daylight hours, and wind it has a bit more like of an unpredictable schedule, but it's also been modeled, and the wind like resource and variability kind of depends on the location. But yeah, when you combine battery energy storage systems, essentially you are charging the batteries like while there's an excess of power, like for solar in the middle of the day, and then the batteries can discharge when there's usually an excess of demand. So that would be in the evening hours. And this way, you're providing more hours of the day where you're running on renewable energy. And so California's grid has reached like 100% renewable energy for multiple hours of the day recently. The biggest challenge is like having long duration energy storage. So our current battery systems usually last 4 hours. And so they can cover that evening peak, but they can't like really cover the rest of the night.
I think a lot of, like you're describing, a lot of the states make these really great goals when it comes to reducing emissions and improving our energy grid, making it more resilient. But what's the policy maneuver that takes the goal and puts it into practice? Like what gets solar panels on people's roofs of their homes versus just having these extenuated goals? Because in Vermont we have, a lot of great focus on this topic, but some of the goals they're not always politically friendly. Maybe like an example, we have a clean heat standard in Vermont where the idea is to over time replace the oil heating in people's homes to a more renewable source. And it's a great intention, but on the political side of it, it can feel like the government telling people how to heat their homes, and it's a bit intrusive from my perspective. Or we have some of the goals that you've described where we want to be net zero by X date, and if we don't reach that goal, the state has given the ability to private citizens or organizations or companies to sue the state for not meeting the goals. And right now we haven't made a lot of progress on those goals. And so it doesn't seem super practical to be staring down a pipe of lawsuits when you're trying to achieve these goals. So how do we make it happen?
Okay. Yeah, those are interesting points.
In practice and politically.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I'd love to learn more about the propositions in Vermont that are receiving backlash. But yeah, I'll just start with like overall, because you mentioned like how do we get people to like put solar panels on their roofs, for example. So I think a lot of we can differentiate this into like rooftop solar versus like utility scale solar. So let's talk first on like the distributed generation level, which is just like they use the term behind the meter a lot, which means it's like located on your property, literally like behind the utility meter. It's your own generation. For rooftop solar, I believe the main driver would be your utility incentive programs. Like I know net metering is very common in a lot of states, or rebates. So I think this is what I've learned in class, but like utilities are bound to these like renewable portfolio standards. These are laws, like they need to reach, at least this is the case in California, like California is bound, they have to reach 100% clean energy by 2045. So the way my professor put it is that like that is going to happen. Utilities will incentivize you. The thing that we're like really facing now in California, I think it's like kind of because California's always been like a pioneer in these things, so they're kind of like encountering unprecedented issues before the rest of the states are. We're like facing these unique issues here now where like rooftop solar is seen as like a good thing for the environment in most states, right? But here we are actually like hoping to decrease rooftop solar penetration because what's happened is so many people have put rooftop solar on their homes that according to the California Public Utilities Commission's analysis, people like participating in the incentive program, they've of course like been super happy with it. Like they've benefited a ton. They've gotten like, a lot of money back from the utility. Essentially this net metering program like pays you for the electricity that you're generating with your like rooftop solar. But the thing is, like, utilities have to recover all their costs. So essentially, like, the incentive program or rebate that utilities are paying has to be recovered by non-participants in the program who are just customers of the utility, but they do not participate in the rooftop solar program. And yeah, there's an equity implication as well, where like people who don't own their homes, or like they cannot afford a rooftop solar system, like the upfront cost of it, are less likely to implement and less likely to participate. So it's kind of skewing the benefits towards those who are, more well off and able to afford rooftop solar. So, and the way my professor put it is that like we don't need more rooftop solar because California is going to reach its 2045 100% clean energy goal. So essentially he's like, we should just build more utility scale solar. And so,
what do you mean by utility scale?
Yeah, so by utility scale solar, essentially meaning those like giant solar farms. Typically, like I would say anything over like 50 megawatts counts as utility scale. But just to put this into perspective, for those who are less familiar with solar projects, so I used to work on these like 1 to 5 megawatt projects, and just for perspective, like a megawatt is a million watts. And my 1 megawatt solar project in Virginia had around like 3,000 solar panels that were like 580 watts each. I hope I'm doing the math correctly. And my 5 megawatt solar projects had like, 12,000 or slightly more solar panels. So these are, even like a 5 megawatt project is like 50 acres and like pretty substantial. So you can imagine like a utility scale project at 50 megawatts or even like 100 megawatts or 500 megawatts. So
it's a lot of land and a lot of panels, right?
For those giant ones, like 500 megawatts, you're mainly talking like Nevada desert, like Arizona desert, it's like unused like wasteland essentially, where they're able to build something of that scale. But yeah, so the main incentives, going back to the question, how can we get more clean energy built? And I know you probably wanted to talk about the land impacts too, so we'll do that next. But the main incentives are just like the cost of solar is cheaper than fossil fuels now. So we use an economic metric called like the levelized cost of electricity a lot in our studies here. And so essentially that's like a techno-economic like value that's calculated using like discount rates. So like the money now is worth more than money later. And also just like taking into account the initial like upfront investment of a solar project versus like the initial upfront investment of like a coal power plant or gas plant. And then their fixed and variable costs, so those go into calculating this value as well. So projects like solar typically have like a very high upfront investment, extremely low variable costs, since their energy is it's renewable, it's from the sun, so they don't need like fuel put into the plant. So there are no fuel costs, which is a benefit that really saves a lot of money and like gives you a good return at the end of the project's life. And then and the price of solar panels has just like completely plummeted over the past decade or so, which allows these projects to proliferate and allows them to be like economically more attractive than fossil fuel projects.
That's great. I want to put an emphasis on that. You're saying that, I don't know if everyone knows this, but you're saying that renewable energy is more affordable than fossil fuels?
Yeah, solar and wind specifically are currently like their cost of electricity is lower than fossil fuels, and other renewable energy technologies are getting there. So like this is essentially the crux of like the dilemma we're in right now, right? Because like solar and wind, they're good, but you can't completely rely on them to give you your 100% clean energy goal or your net zero goal, because they're variable. That's what I brought up before, like solar, only peaks during the daytime, no production at night when there's no sun. But with batteries, can be improved, but current battery storage only lasts 4 hours. So long duration energy storage is like a huge research topic, like hugely important. That's people are researching it, and they're
So the field is still looking for new ways to store energy for longer.
Yes,
that's like an evolving landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then other technologies like enhanced geothermal and like also like, yeah, innovations in nuclear are evolving, and those have a lot of potential because those provide like clean, firm resources, we call them. Firm just being like the contrast to like a variable renewable resource.
Because it doesn't depend on sunlight or the wind. It's
exactly
more stable, more reliable maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can generate 24/7 is the idea.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Nuclear can be kind of contentious, but you sound pretty pro nuclear. What's the argument, and where do you stand on it?
Yeah. I guess I have been, I feel like historically I've been pretty neutral and I just haven't thought about nuclear much, but I think as I continue my studies here, I am getting convinced that it's worth pursuing. I know that I shouldn't devalue like the tragic events that have occurred in the past due to nuclear, but it just seems like the pros like do outweigh the cons. Like hopefully we can eliminate any risk. And I know there's like talk of nuclear fusion now as well. So like traditionally all of our nuclear plants were fission, and now one of the other national labs has successfully like completed a fusion experiment. It just needs to be like commercialized and scaled. But this was like a huge like breaking news. So anyways, like the main point being like we have known that fusion exists in the universe for a while, but we have not known how to like synthetically recreate it until now. Like our national labs here in the US like have successfully like done a fusion experiment in the past year. So yeah, that is really exciting stuff. And I guess what's like made me more confident about nuclear is that just like honestly the incredible amount of energy it can provide. I guess I should have started the conversation with this as just like framing the importance of our topic today, but we are at such a like interesting time in energy in our country and in the world, because over the past few decades, ever since the Industrial Revolution, our energy demand as a country has been very stable. So even though we had population growth, we also had like improvements in energy efficiency. So kind of just like everything had neutralized such that our electricity demand was pretty much flatlined, and like state public utilities commissions were having like no problems like with affordability. Like nobody was ever complaining. They really had like the easiest jobs because electricity was cheap and it was abundant, and so it really wasn't like on the national headlines in the past few decades. And then now with the advent of AI, and this is something we can talk about more, the advent of AI and also like the increasing electrification of things like cars and heating, now we're seeing like this extreme like increase in demand for electricity. And because of that, we kind of like, as much as we do need to plan and think about like which generation sources we are going to use, we also just have this like rush to build and rush to like increase generation to meet demand. So I think nuclear is really like something we'll have to utilize, because even just one nuclear plant is able to provide like a massive amount of energy. It's insane. Like I think, gosh, if I'm not mistaken, like I think one nuclear plant can provide like a gigawatt of energy, which is twice the giant 500 megawatt solar plants I was talking about earlier. Like a gigawatt is 1 billion watts. So yeah, extreme amount of energy. And like I'll just use like Taiwan as an example, because that's where my mom is from, and I'm familiar with Taiwan, and I was recently I'm actually working on a research project for Taiwan's energy security right now at Stanford too.
Cool.
Yeah, which is a whole like another like interesting topic in energy security, because if you think the US is in a energy crisis, Taiwan really would be if something were to go wrong, geopolitically, because it's an island, it's isolated, and yeah. So the US is actually like really collaborating with Taiwan right now on their energy security, and Stanford's been tapped to work with like leading institutions there. Essentially though, like going back to my point on nuclear, so Taiwan historically had three nuclear plants, and they were able to provide 20% of the country's like entire electricity demand, just with three plants. And for context, Taiwan has a population of 25 million people, I believe. So it's not a small country. It's like, yeah, it would compare to like one of the larger states in America. Um, and yeah, so for context, they have like, 20 coal plants or something, and that provides like 50% of electricity. So nuclear is just so efficient. You can fit so much like power output into one location without needing to like have these like land use concerns, and also like no greenhouse gas emissions concerns. But unfortunately in Taiwan, they like really had like bad fallout from the Fukushima meltdowns that occurred in Japan, because Taiwan's also in a fault zone and like tsunami zone. And the ruling party right now has been like very anti-nuclear since the start. So they had decommissioned all three nuclear plants, and that honestly like worsened the energy crisis there, because now 20% of their electricity supply all of a sudden disappeared. And they have a very ambitious like net zero goal. Like they want to be not only like 100% clean energy, but also like completely net zero by 2050, which is super hard for an island grid, especially with like, yeah, geopolitical concerns. So they are kind of in a crisis now where they're like, well, we don't want to use coal and gas because, yeah, because they have these ambitious like renewables targets. But they ended up like that 20% that disappeared due to nuclear, like ended up all being like natural gas, like that they have to import now. And so they're importing tons of like liquefied natural gas, which, has associated greenhouse gas emissions, and they're importing it from countries around the world. But if like China were to stage a blockade, Taiwan would like run out of fuel supply in, I think, like 2 weeks maybe. I think I saw that somewhere. Yeah, so it would be like catastrophic. And it ties back to energy security, what we were talking about earlier. Like if you're able to generate electricity like on like for Taiwan, like on island, it's just so much, less risky than having to import your fuel and power supply.
Really
So that made me kind of like a fan of nuclear. And actually like the ruling party in Taiwan is now like looking into like recommissioning or like, yeah, restarting some of those nuclear power plants, because the public has kind of shifted their opinion and like really thinks that Taiwan like needs this energy now, just because like there's such land use constraints there. And they also are like a big player in AI, like chip manufacturing, and so there's just like no way they can get all this like power supply to meet demand without nuclear power.
Oh. Yeah, it's definitely not faultless. Like you have to find what to do with the byproduct. But
Yeah,
it seems like it's just super, super efficient, which is
exactly.
the big plus.
Yeah, there's pros and cons to everything.
Well, let's talk about landscape. You brought it up. That's one of the big arguments against these, large solar arrays that you're talking about, coast, on coast. People, understandably, I think, don't always want to look at these giant solar fields or don't want to cut down their forests to have them put in. What's that conversation like in your field, and how can we work around that?
Yeah, great question. And yeah, like people's concerns are super valid. And this is something I've worked closely with, so I can speak on this pretty well since I worked for a solar developer. So you mentioned like cutting down trees. Ideally, we would find sites where that's not necessary. So I'll just give anecdotally like what our target strategy for like site selection was at my company that I worked at previously as a project manager. So essentially our business model was that we would lease land from private landowners. So these were typically like farm families who'd been on their land for many decades, and they were looking for a new revenue stream. And of course, like, these people were open to this idea.
Partnership.
Yeah, exactly. It's meant to be a partnership. So I was working in Maine and also Virginia. So I got to talk to a lot of these landowners, and they were generally happy with how things were going. And yeah, so the most common situation, I believe, was like the farm. They were looking, I think younger generations especially were looking for like a new stream of income. So we would often like kind of like our land development team would kind of frame it as like, think of solar as like another crop on your land, except one that's not at risk to like, extreme weather events like destroying the crops or like volatility in prices. So like just as you could have like 50 acres of corn or like 50 acres of wheat, instead you have like this 50 acres of solar. And ideally, the land is going to be restored at the end of the project lifetime. We always had to like write these decommissioning plans, saying that, in 30 years or 40 years when the project reaches end of life, like here's our step-by-step plan on how to restore the land, or like if the landowner wants to like continue with like a new project, you could do that too. But this was like always required by like as much as like different counties I worked in had very different and confusing permitting processes, like the decommissioning plan was always a requirement. So we always submitted that. And yeah, I think we were facing a lot of like at Stanford, I think like in industry they call it like NIMBYism, which is an acronym for not in my backyard ism. So I understand like, I think I personally think solar is okay to look at, but I get it for, like a nuclear reactor or something. I probably wouldn't want to look at that. And you'd be very unfortunate if you happen to get a nuclear reactor in your backyard because there's so few of them, and they usually serve so much energy.
There are a lot of places in this country, like the Arizona or Nevada desert, where these aren't, people's family farms that they want to preserve, or these aren't forests. These are uninhabited lands. And I live in Idaho right now, and it's everywhere. I mean, this land is massive, and a lot of it's just unused. And
yeah,
it gets a lot
really
of sun.
is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of space in the West, especially to just build these massive projects. But yeah, I guess like back east where you're from, where I lived for a while, it just takes a lot of partnership, really. But I mean, these solar companies are definitely like compensating these landowners really well. Like these landowners are making much more than they would have like with, if they kept their like 50 acres of soybeans instead of like 50 acres of solar. Like they have a much more like reliable income stream as well. So it's like a monthly lease that they're paid. Like, cause we did have a lot of like soybean farmers in Virginia who leased land to us, and I know that like soybeans made the headlines like a couple months ago, right? Because like China stopped accepting the US's soybeans or something like that, and like farmers were not getting paid for their product. There was a lot of like farmers outrage like towards Trump for that, and he had to find a way to exactly, through the tariffs. Yeah, so I think there are benefits to people, and it really just takes like partnership and communication and understanding. Like a lot of that work is just done like at the ground level, and it doesn't make the news. Like, but yeah, I had talked to like a lot of our landowners in Virginia and Maine, and they're like really lovely people. And yeah, I do hope like that they are happy with the projects. From what I know, they were. Of course, like construction is always gonna have like logistics to work out, but beyond like the construction phase, once everything's done and looks nice, like we always made sure that like native plants were like growing with the solar panels too. And like I know agrivoltaics is also possible, where you're like growing crops or like you have livestock like intermingling with the panels to kind of like create more of like an ecosystem. But yeah, so I do think like there are opportunities to hopefully like mitigate NIMBYism and help people see that like at least solar is beneficial in their community. And it's good to have like generation nearby. It's like we worked on these smaller scale like solar farms that were, powering like the communities themselves. Like our model is called community solar. And so like you are also saving like and you're saving power and being more efficient by like generating close to where the demand is rather than like sending gigawatts and gigawatts of power over like these long distance transmission lines.
It's another perk. I'm hoping at some point to have some small farmers onto the show from my hometown or from other parts of Vermont. That'd be an interesting question to pose to them, and they're facing a lot of challenges already, especially in the dairy industry. It's the industry is becoming more conglomerated. The bigger farms are getting bigger, and the small family farms are oftentimes going out of business. Vermont's lost a lot of dairy farms over the last 50 years. So maybe solar panels could be another source of revenue to keep them on their land, to keep them doing what they love. So I like to take the optimistic side on that.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. And I'll just mention quickly, like, I mean, yeah, hopefully I'm not just ignorant on dairy farms here, but essentially, like, we would also build, like, rooftop systems. So, because we had just driven by this giant, like, I don't think this was a family dairy farm, but we had driven by this, like, giant cattle operation in California on the way from LA back to the Bay Area, and it seemed like there was a lot of like canopy space like above the cows, and so if you don't want to like use extra land to put the solar panels, like commercial or like large scale rooftop systems are also very feasible. So that's something that could be possible. Our company also paid leases to commercial landowners for their rooftops.
Throw some panels on the milking barn.
Yeah.
All right. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to get to data centers. We mentioned it earlier. When I talked about this Iran conflict, we think about it in the present. This is interrupting our energy supply right now, and it's causing price increases right now. But like you mentioned, we're consuming more and more energy, period. So tomorrow we're going to need more than we have today. And AI is a big reason why. How can we meet the growing demand for energy? How can we navigate data centers both in respect to the environment and the pretty large political risk they pose, kind of in the same vein with some of the NIMBYism and not, people don't want to live next to data centers?
Yeah, great question. Super relevant topic. And I think, at Stanford, like there's such a large focus on AI, so we hear about this all the time. But yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the main issues around NIMBYism and supply and demand for these data centers. So I think Congress could really help out here. So at Stanford, we're doing a lot of work on like trying to, first of all, like forecast the additional energy demand from these data centers, because we know that like demand has increased since the dawn of generative AI taking off, like ChatGPT. So, essentially since like 2024 or so, but that only gives us like 2 years of data. So a lot of researchers are trying to forecast like how is that demand going to keep growing? Is it going to be like exponential for the next several years, or is it going to like, plateau at some point? So there's a lot of like predictive modeling work going on there. And something that's really making it challenging for these predictive models to be accurate, or just like, decreasing uncertainty in these predictive models, is that these hyperscalers, so by hyperscalers we're talking about, Meta, Google, like the typical culprits, they are really like putting a wedge in the forecasting by like throwing out like 5 or 6 like different permit applications for each like data center they build, because essentially these companies are like so massive in scale and like so well resourced like financially, that they can like build these data centers anywhere, and they're targeting like 5 or 6 sites at once for one proposed project. So they're applying like for permits to like many different counties, sometimes in different states for what will only end up as one project, but they're kind of just trying to get like whatever they can right now because they're just like in a race, to deploy. So I think something that Congress could help out with is like one, like limiting the amount of permit applications that they can like create for one project, or if not that, then at least like I think co-location of the generation like with the demand would be very beneficial. So like what I mean by that is like, and many like hyperscalers have already done this. It's easier for them too because oftentimes they're building these like places where power needs to be like shipped long distances to even reach the data center. So if they're able to, I mean, they have like, trillions of dollars in their market cap. They have more than enough resources to build co-located generation. They can build like an on-site small modular reactors, like a nuclear potential, or they can build like battery or solar systems because like some of these data centers are out in like the Nevada desert. Others are, we're talking about like a suburban like Virginia data center
Virginia,
that would
I think,
be
has the most data centers of
yeah.
any state.
I did see that, and yeah, Virginia's experiencing some pretty bad like reliability woes, partially due to that. So yeah, we haven't really talked about reliability yet, but my research is on reliability and resilience of the grid. Those are two big words that get thrown around a lot now too. So yeah, with like increased demand and like unpredictable demand as well, like reliability can be impacted, and the risk of outages goes way up, like past what utilities are like allowed essentially. But yeah, there are other innovations that are occurring though that make me hopeful that the power demand for data centers will be lower than like the worst case scenario is like exponential growth for like many years into the future. There are other people who are saying like it'll actually plateau earlier because like NVIDIA, for example, they've already like pioneered and deployed this new like chip cooling method where they can use water at lower temperatures. So essentially like the chips, right, they reach high temperatures because they're running and doing all this computing. And in order to cool them back down, like a lot of like water. Yeah, so this is the water issue coming in too. A lot of water needs to be like flowed through the system to cool these chips. And then so there's like heating and cooling going on, which creates more power demand as well. So NVIDIA found a way to decrease that temperature delta between cold and hot needed, such that like the heating and cooling demands are much lower. And that's really helping with like efficiency of chip cooling. We had a little problem on that in our thermodynamics homework for one problem set. But yeah, so like I am hopeful that some of these tech companies are conscious. Hopefully they have some ounce of concern for society.
Do you think there is?
I don't know. It
I
depends.
mean, they make the pitch that they're paying attention.
Oh man, yeah, I'm not convinced. I think I have a generally pretty good impression of NVIDIA, but I may be biased. Jensen Huang just, I don't know, he seems like a good guy, and he went to Stanford, and he's also Taiwanese, so I feel some personal, like, affinity. But yeah, I don't know. It's always profits first, isn't it? So yeah, I don't really know what the hyperscalers are prioritizing. So I know there's like a debate right now, you may have heard this too, but affordability is a huge issue. Electricity affordability, like rates are rising, especially in California. And there's talk of like, in Vermont too, yeah. And there's talk of like data centers interconnecting to the grid, creating all this extra demand, and that like potentially making electricity rates rise even further, which so like I think the like consensus answer on that from researchers is like it kind of depends on like the other factors in the grid there, but yes, it could like cause demand, like extra demand could cause prices to rise. And so like something that has been talked about policy wise is like maybe like just requiring the hyperscalers to pay for any like increases in electricity costs, like, pay for their supply, essentially, like, just pay a higher rate than residential
Than a
customers.
household, yeah.
Yeah, like that's only fair, isn't it? And like they have like endless resources financially. Yeah, so I think, this is like a general trend or like a general theme, but like Congress is like a little bit behind on AI regulation.
I'm on a lot.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, but there are things that could be done, but yeah, as I've learned more about policymaking in classes here, like the way that electricity rates are set too, I do see like why it's hard to know exactly what will be a successful lever. Like there's so many economic considerations and the outcomes are not always predictable if you don't just like try. And yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of gridlock. So
It sounds like there's a lot we don't know. We don't exactly have a concrete idea of how much energy we'll need, how much
mhm.
water we'll need to cool chips. I'm no AI expert or anything like that, but the podcasts I listen to, they talk about it quite often, and it seems like there's a lot of competing schools of thought on what AI will mean in the future, and really nobody has it figured out. So, and expecting, 80-year-old Congress members to navigate these issues is just a whole
Yeah,
nother problem.
I will say there's one 80-year-old Congress member who's pretty on the mark, Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
I went to his talk at Stanford, and him and I don't know if I told you about this, Dylan, or I don't know if I told Allie, but yeah, Bernie Sanders and Ro Khanna came to talk at Stanford about
Cool.
the rise of AI and what it'll look like for our economy and just for like societal health in general. And it was a great talk, and yeah, Senator Sanders is really impressive for just as a human, but also for someone his age. He's so sharp, and yeah, Ro Khanna is also like very sharp, and he's in the loop on AI because he's from Silicon Valley. So I think the two of them really make a good pair where Senator Sanders is fighting for our rights, and Ro Khanna is kind of providing him like some of the technical background on AI. So yeah, Vermont's
Great.
very proud of him, I'm sure.
Yeah, Bernie is probably the spryest 80
Yeah.
something I've ever
Yeah.
met or seen.
No, he's amazing. Like, yeah, in person, he was no different than in like his recorded speeches. I was super impressed, and yeah, brought a tear to my eye to hear him like so passionate, and yeah, just everything I expected. It was great.
Great. Well, it's definitely consequential and it's high stakes, so I'm glad we could have this conversation and kind of flesh through some of these ideas. I hope the listeners have enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I'm amazed by your understanding of these issues. I'm just starting to wrap my head around them on
I'm
a very
still
basic level.
There's so much to learn. It's kind of insane. I feel like the more I've learned in my classes, the more complicated these issues seem to get. So I guess that's how things go. And yeah, hopefully I explained things okay. I know, yeah, being a student, you're kind of just like in this bubble of like thought where you're working on your homeworks and projects.
Well, maybe we can wrap up by and just, I painted a picture of what's going on today a little bit with the war and some of the issues facing our energy economy. Maybe you can leave us with a picture of your dream energy future in America or in the.
Yeah, great question. So yeah, I mean, it goes without saying that my dream for America's and our world's energy future is to have like a functional net zero economy where, not only are we preventing like further greenhouse gas emissions, but also like everything like makes economic sense, and all ideally like energy should not, or like renewable energy and clean energy should not be like a political issue. I think that's something we didn't talk about today, but yeah, like using Taiwan as an example again, like both parties in Taiwan, like they have their differences. So essentially, there's like the ruling party, which is like the Democratic People's Party. They're like pro Taiwan independence from China, and then there's the other party, the KMT, the Kuomintang. They are kind of like a more like one China approach. But the amazing thing is like these two parties like completely agree, other than the one anti-nuclear thing, they completely agree on like the renewable portfolio standard and the net zero goal in 2050. Like even though one is like, the older, like kind of more like traditionally conservative party, like environmental issues are not a political matter. Like they both believe in like the underlying science of climate change. They understand that, human induced climate change is real. That's just simply not like a matter to be debated. They're both on track to reach like clean energy goals, and so it's very like disappointing in America that like in our like two-party system, like the environment just happens to be one of these issues that we've decided to split apart as like a contentious back and forth things. It really doesn't need to be, and like ideally everyone would just be in agreement that like climate change is real and we need to work towards mitigating it. I know in America there are a lot of like, money, like financial interests in oil and whatnot, which we could talk about another time.
The biggest reason for the split there, but
yeah, yeah, but in Taiwan, I'm sure there's financial interests in oil too.
it's true.
There's fossil fuel companies. Somehow it just never like went to a point where that is like the split between the two parties. Yeah, I would be curious to like dig into kind of like the driving forces behind
do
that.
some comparative politics. Is it history? Is it culture? Why is it a partisan issue here but not there?
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, definitely one of my dreams is to just not have it be a partisan issue and make everything so much easier if our federal government could like be working on like renewable energy technologies, like working on like grid modernization every year instead of just like the past couple decades it's been like 4 years on, 4 years off, 4 years on, 4 years off, like making great strides with the IRA, for example, in 2022, and then like undoing all of it and then just repeating the cycle. It's so disappointing because we're starting to fall behind like other countries when it comes to clean energy goals. And I mean, I believe that there's no going back at this point. Like, why are we choosing to pretend these things don't exist when like the clean energy industry is like a wave that cannot be stopped across the world? These things are already happening. The US is missing out on business opportunities by like canceling these clean energy projects.
Missing out, like as we discussed today, we're missing out on affordability, we're missing out on reliability, and we're missing out on stability when these regional conflicts start clashing. It'd be an amazing world where we just wouldn't have to worry about the Strait of Hormuz for many reasons.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a dream of mine, and just like some of the more emerging technologies, like EGS, and like small modular reactors, like hoping those can be commercialized quickly and scaled, because as I mentioned, those are really essential to provide like that clean, firm, they call it baseload power, like when it operates 24/7. We'll need clean, firm power resources to provide electricity, when wind and solar are not able to. And then the other key, I believe, is like the long duration energy storage. So right now the batteries, battery energy storage systems that are typically paired with solar, they have a 4-hour duration, which means like in the evening peak after the sun goes down, those batteries have been charging during the day when the sun is out, and then they discharge at a constant rate for 4 hours. But after that 4-hour evening peak, they are depleted. So if we can develop long duration energy storage and at the same time like potentially like use AI and like smart grid sensors to kind of like optimize all of these things, like we'd be charging and discharging batteries like at optimized windows, if we have like days long or at least like 12-hour long storage. It could really make a difference, and I think that would be like the final piece in reaching like 100% clean energy.
Cool. We'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for coming on the show. Maybe we can do it again sometime when I keep learning some more about this topic.
Yeah, I would love to have a follow-up conversation. And I think, this was my first ever podcast interview, so I was a little nervous. And I'm also just, a first-year master's student, so I have much to learn too. But I will say I've already learned a lot in both quarters I've been here. So hopefully only more of that and not too much stress in my graduate studies.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Dylan. It's been such a pleasure to talk about this today.
Thanks for joining.